Helge Lurås, heartily welcome to the Herland report. We're airing from Scandinavia and speaking about what threatens Europe today. And you are the editor of a new magazine or a newspaper in Norway called Resett. And I know that one of the reasons why you guys started to launch this newspaper is due to the strict elitist censorship that we live under today in the West. We have a media that speaks about news in such a way that they actually hide what really are the dangers in Europe and in the West.
You could say so, but I think to a large extent they don't know or are not conscious on what they actually hide. It's sort of built into the expectations, the ideology and the paradigm that sort of keeps them from realizing what's happening. So I think mostly it's due to that unconscious process rather than a deliberate attempt to hide the truth from the people.
But when you look at the leaders, the editors, the chief editors and the editors in the media structure, I mean, they must know. How stupid can you be pertaining to the Middle East? I mean, it's not possible to be that stupid, really. It's not possible to be able to for us to have a media that is this biased in case after case after case after case. It's too structured in a biased way for me to believe that they do not know what they're doing.
Well, some know what they're doing or are conscious about the, I would presume, what you could call the manipulation of news and the way it is biased. But the overall sort of way of thinking in terms of foreign policy since the early 1990s, which have been very prevalent, is a sort of idealism, which has based itself on the belief that the West are on the right path, that we have the best model, that this model is really a universal model, and that the actions that our own democracies take are overall the best way forward also for other societies. And in this case, it's very difficult for them to criticize themselves or ourselves in the West. And when then the realities of foreign policy might differ from their expectations about our ability to do good, we get what you can call cognitive dissonance. And that the effect of that is largely that you either, you will have to then disregard the empirical facts that appear before your eyes and continue to believe that the path you are down on is also the best one. So it's a complicated process. I know that many people who look critically on this are of the opinion that it's sort of a sinister conspiracy, that it's overt manipulation. But had it only been that, then we could change it easier than if it's built into our ideology and the way we see things and the paradigm that we live in, and also that is being produced in the academic institutions and then also in the media. So we have a huge problem in terms of changing this attitude, because it's so ingrained in our thinking.
Could you say that it corresponds with what the French writer Michel Houellebecq speaks about when he says that the map doesn't match the terrain anymore, the ideological map that maybe was some sort of thinking that fit well in the 1960s doesn't fit to explain the terrain as it is in 2020?
Yeah, I would agree with that. It's a simpler way of saying what I was trying to say, really. Although I'm not sure if the map ever corresponded to the terrain, but it took some time to show itself so clearly as we have it now, because the policy that map was based on has taken time to materialize, because it's a very sort of, it bases itself on a conception of human nature and also social processes that is very sort of utopian, idealistic. But during the Cold War, this urge to reform, to make things universal, was kept in check by the realities of power balance between the West and the Eastern Bloc and the Soviet Union. But when the Soviet Union fell apart and the Cold War was over, the West became hegemonic, at least for a time, and could that sort of put its own experiments and utopias into effect and then the subsequent interventions we had in Somalia, in Bosnia, in Kosovo, in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, etc. And when these experiments then showed itself not to fulfill the expectations, we have a situation where it now seems that the map doesn't correspond to reality, but I think it's been the case all along. This utopia that many believed from the 60s onwards have never been anything else but a utopia, but now it's proving itself more clearly to more people, and that's why we also see a reaction against the establishment and against the media and even against the academic disciplines that have been most heavily involved in producing the narrative that now is no longer producing believable results.
Many fear the future, and many speak about us living in like the final days of the Roman Empire, so to speak. And it's really perplexing to see how weak the Western leadership is. Under Obama, one day he says one thing, the next day he says another thing. I mean, we see the same with heads of NATO, one day one thing, next day, I mean, they invade here and there, they lose everywhere. I think the Americans haven't won a war since the Vietnam War, which wasn't won either. And considering what Robert McNamara spoke of after In the Fog of War, the famous documentary, he said, we were wrong all along. We went into conflicts and took sides and supported one of the parties in the conflict and thought we would know how to win through that. And I mean, it's just loss after loss after loss. So it seems this utopianism has been a bad idea, and maybe realism would have been a better choice.
I would definitely say so. It would. Although with the United States it's a bit too early, I think, to really judge whether the overall policy is failed or not. I mean, you could still argue that there might be enough people in the United States that pursue sort of a grand strategy, sort of a geopolitical game that has been part of the US foreign policy strategy for a long time, which is really to keep both their flanks weak, both in East Asia and in Europe, keep it somewhat divided, to hinder any power to really be dominant in its own region. In that sense, to have the occasional skirmish, the occasional war here and there might not be that bad for that grand strategy. But to what extent that kind of geopolitical strategy is pursued in the United States is a bit difficult to say. I think to some extent it is, because you have certain institutions in the United States where this kind of thinking is definitely part of the picture, which differs in the United States from Europe, which has largely, it seems to me, lost its perception of its own self-interest. It's become very local and regional and really internal to a large extent, the problems we have, and we don't, in Europe we don't really have a perception that we, in a sense, should survive as nations. And if you're a leader of a group who doesn't want to exist, it's difficult to pursue a sensible policy. And I think that's what you see with European leaders, because we have been infused with this universal ideal where any kind of interest that you base on a particular group of people is sort of illegitimate, immoral, and then it becomes almost impossible to pursue a sensible foreign policy. But also this thinking, this European Western thinking, has also infused the United States. So we have then seen these interventions which have been motivated to a large extent by leftist liberal ideals of spreading democracy, and the result has been a chaotic situation in the periphery of Europe, which then has aggravated the migration crisis. And then so in combination with the fact that we don't really feel that we have the moral right to close our own borders, migration is sort of spreading into Europe and weakening the states from within. And in that sense, to put a parallel with the Roman Empire, I think it's worth reflecting upon, because if we do not change course or determine what we want to do in the future, our predicament in Europe might be quite bad.
And it's interesting to see as well how the American idea of posing sanctions on Russia was really quite a brilliant way of doing it, because this has also produced many problems in Europe. And looking at, I mean, it has greatly weakened Europe even more. So if the American idea is to weaken Europe, the Russian sanctions have really worked very well. I mean, when you look at the close historical relationship between Germany and Russia, for example, I mean, when you go to Moscow, you see all the beautiful carriages and everything that was given from the German emperors. There were close ties, I mean, between those nations. We come from Scandinavia and Norway, and here our export, so much of it. We lost so many of the small businesses and middle-income businesses due to the sanctions to Russia, so against Russia. So that's a smart move too, to weaken natural allies, the Russian continent and the Russian nation and Europe. I mean, parts of Russia is really part of Europe as well.
Yes, in this kind of geopolitical perspective, in weakening your flanks, it makes sense to put some strains in the relationship, especially between Germany, the potential dominant power in Western Europe, and then also Russia as the Eurasian power. I think that when it comes to the Russian policy, it seems to me that is to a large extent driven by the forces of what's often called the military-industrial congressional complex, which has been sort of taking advantage of NATO expansion, because that entails also that you have compatibility with military hardware, and then American military manufacturers can sell more of their weapons. And some level of instability helps weapon producers, and because I think that is very much has a role to play in the aggressive sanction policies against Russia. Because if you look on it geopolitically, at least when it comes to the main challenge there is for the United States, which I believe to be China, it might perhaps then serve American, at least long-term interest, to have a relatively good relationship with Russia, so that China is weakened also on its western flank and have a potentially hostile power there. But the Americans have the ability to switch on and off their relationship with Russia to a much larger extent than Western European countries. So it remains to be seen what the American policy on Russia will be. I see, actually, in terms of strategic terms, in the future, a quite close and relatively good relationship between Russia and the United States, based on the fact that China will be the main challenge to the United States' dominant role.
It's a paradox too that much of the sanctions against Iran, I mean, it's been going on for a long time, and in the West I do believe we have some sort of concept that if we put sanctions on somebody, then their whole world falls apart. And what we've seen with Iran is that all their oil production now serves China. So the more you put sanctions on Iran, the more you strengthen actually the Asian and Southeast Asian and the geopolitical shift towards the East. And this has been happening with Russia as well, as we know. I mean, you know, then they get the loans from China instead, and so the negativity and the let's say some of these pushes from the West pertaining to sanctions really just strengthen the nations that are further to the east, and which would be a big problem is if there were any problems between Saudi Arabia and the United States. What if Saudi as well started selling their oil, for example, not in dollars or something else, and started turning to China because it's a really growing market. So and the same has been happening in Israel too. I mean, especially under Obama. There was a big unrest in Israel politically over that, and Netanyahu started traveling to Moscow, speaking to Putin 4 times a year, and still does that. So I think also there is a realization in countries such as Israel. I've spoken to Jonathan Medved, one of the billionaires in Israel, in a program just like this one, and he clearly said that, well, it's just a media thing that we don't speak to the Arab nations. We have more trade with them now and more trade towards the East. Forget about Europe. If you don't like us, forget about us. You're not the main market anymore. We're second on Nasdaq. Why should we sit and wait for you? There's a whole world out there.
Well, yeah, I mean, Europe is of course, I mean, could be considered largely irrelevant, but the United States is definitely not irrelevant to Israel. And when it comes to the policy on Iran, well, you know, the American policy overall, geopolitically speaking, would be to keep any power in any region to be dominant. And Iran has a very interesting location and sort of a potential strength that makes it a potential hegemon in the Middle East. And it is in the American interest to keep that from happening. And then they would normally balance with their relationship to other nations like Iran, like Iraq, Turkey, Israel. But so in that sense, it makes sense because Iran belongs really to different regions. It belongs to the Middle East, but it also belongs to Central Asia. It also plays a role even further into Asia. So it's a very sort of prized object in geopolitical terms. But I think also that the American policy when it comes to Iran is very much influenced by views from Israel. Because Israel is particularly concerned about a rising Iran and has been very clearly lobbying the United States to take a tough tone. And they were very disappointed with the reproach between the United States and Iran. And there has been sort of pointed out in American discourse as well that American foreign policy is overly sort of dominated by views from Israel, which might in some senses be parallel with the United States, but in other particulars of that policy might go against American interests. So America has a complex relationship in the Middle East. It might not always be possible to analyze American actions purely on American interest.
So what threatens Europe today?
Well, mainly for Europe, I think what threatens us in terms of foreign policy or security policy is the breakdown of states in the periphery of Europe, in Africa, in the Middle East, and with the sort of the increase in populations and the flow of migrants that ensue from this chaotic, bad, corrupt situation in many of these countries. Because Europe is not really morally capable of stopping the migrants from coming, and when the flow of people are on the level that we have seen over the past few years, that really creates political turbulence internally in European nations. It creates problems for the European Union because Western European and Eastern European countries have very different attitudes towards immigration. So this whole complex of migration, immigration, integration, assimilation is really the main dominant topic of European policy, both internal policy and foreign policy, and it's very intertwined. So I think definitely that is the main challenge. But there are not minor, but there are sort of additional aspects to European challenges in foreign policy that is related to the very close dependence on the United States and the lack of a creative, self-conscious foreign policy thinking in the European capitals on how their own interests might in some senses align with the United States, but might in other instances not correspond to those of the United States. So it's sort of I would say that the establishment in Europe is confused about both their challenges and their own standing or standpoint or point of view in terms of how to look into the future. So we need to, in Europe, to sort of sort out our thinking, to start thinking more clearly about our own interests and how they might be seen in the perspective of the other countries that we are related to in our periphery, both closely to us, but also the more dominant powers somewhat more distanced from Europe itself.
Would you concur that the main overall threat against Europe today is its own politicians and its own incapable leaders that are incapable of solving the problems in Europe? They're incapable, maybe due to their beliefs in ideologies that belonged in the 1960s, or for other reasons, ideologies of due to that, because we seem to have a whole generation of politicians who are not able to do anything but smile, and they do not address in the media the current issues. They are not able, all these ladies in the EU, are not able to even solve something as simple as a refugee crisis, where you have millions of illegal immigrants and you just allow them to flood in to your nation. And I am often in Italy, and in Milan and many places, you can't even speak to people about the migration crisis because they say, look, the minute they set their foot in Italy, they're entitled to 50 euros a day. They come with the best iPhones that I do not have money to buy. I am paid 50 euros and I work 8 hours here in Italy. They just come and walk around and steal, and they, have all kinds of allegations against all these people, and they say, I would like to apply to be a refugee too. How? They don't need to pay taxes, they just come marching in. Isn't that the complete and utter failure of our weak and weakling politicians?
Yes, it is. I mean, during the migration crisis in 2015, it was Viktor Orban who sort of showed them what to do, because they claim basically there is nothing they could do with this refugee crisis. But then Viktor Orban showed them that you could actually close the borders. And that then spread, and eventually Macedonia closed its border to Greece at the same time as the deal was hammered out between Germany and Turkey, of course. But they are weak, I agree. But if it had only been the fact that it was the politicians that was the problem, we could sort of shift them out, get some new politicians in. But it is part of the thinking of much broader segments of society than just the politician. This is something that is being socialized into our education system. It's something the message is being spread by the media, so that a large part of the people who actually elect these politicians are of the same weak nature, they have the same incapacity to actually decide to take action. But we are seeing a shift in in the electorates in the West. We saw that in Brexit, we saw that with the election of Donald Trump as well, that there is this resistance building in the population that will, I think, eventually force the politicians to change. And if they don't change, there will be new politicians most likely being voted in. But that might take some time. And it could also be a very sort of disruptive process that could get out of control in at least for certain periods of times in certain countries of Europe. So the sooner the politicians realize that they are not fulfilling the expectations that people are increasingly having, the better it is in terms of steering the European nations into a more course which is more determined and is more realistic in terms of how to deal with the global problems, how to deal with the failed states that we see around, and how to deal with the migration crisis, which it is necessary that Europe deals with more honestly, realistically in the decades ahead.
Thank you very much, Helge Lurås, Chief Editor of Resett in Norway. Thank you very much for participating here on the Scandinavian Herland Report.
Thank you.